Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I can only claim a limited knowledge of the work of Italo Calvino. When I read Invisible Cities, this was back in 2016, the only thing that I had heard about this author was that some people compared him to Jorge Luis Borges, and other people, maybe more appropriately, compared him to Julio Cortázar. Like Jorge Luis Borges, Calvino speculated with metaphysics, and like Julio Cortázar, he was fond of literary games, so I think the comparisons work, at least at some level. Invisible Cities is one of the most beautiful books that I have ever read, but it still took me at least 2 years to make up my mind and finally open If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which I read for the first time in 2018, and I'm going to tell you why. The fact is that the premise of this book did not particularly appeal to me. But then I read it and I really enjoyed it, and I thought this is another example of the fact that books are often greater than their premises, because it's not really about the what, it's about the how. So If on a Winter's Night a Traveler is a novel that is composed of the beginnings of 10 different novels. And interlaced with that, you have the story of two readers, a man and a woman. The novels within the novel do not conclude, so this makes for very interesting reading. And you need to have that other story, the story of the two readers, so that gives a little bit of unity to what would otherwise be a rather chaotic and very frustrating text, especially for the traditional reader. So if somebody asked me, Jorge, what is If on a Winter's Night a Traveler about? I would say at the level of the subject or the theme, it's just about the adventure of reading. And at the level of the plot or the story, it's about two people who want to read one book but end up reading the openings to 10 different books. Now here's the interesting thing, as if all of this weren't interesting enough. The main character of this book, who is referred to as the reader with a capital R, is the reader of Calvino's novel, who is referred to by the narrator in the second person throughout the text. So that makes for very interesting reading too. And then you have the character of the woman, who is named Ludmila. She is referred to for the most part throughout the novel as the other reader. Now the novels within the novel, they are quite varied in the topic, in the genre, in the approach, in the subject, in all of the possible elements that you can think of. You have, for example, a story that is an erotic tale that has a Japanese theme to it. There's the story of a revolution also. Another story is concerned with a man who is obsessed with mirror images. You also have a Mexican tale that features the kind of themes that you would find in Latin American fiction, for example, fate, ghosts, inheritance, revenge, things like that. And there's also the story of a man and a woman, which is like a type of noir narrative, who are trying to get rid of a corpse. So as you can see, there are plenty of things here to enjoy. It seems that there is something for everybody within this book by Italo Calvino. Now the reader, he, she, however you want to approach it, does not encounter all of these stories in the form of a physical text. To give you one quick example, there's one story that has the form of a diary, and this story is read to the reader within the novel by a professor who is translating the diary as he goes, as he reads. And the reader gets into the story every single time. He or she wants to find some kind of a conclusion, wants to continue reading, but there's always a problem. For example, blank pages. Or for example, it just so happens that the novel at that point, the one that he or she was reading, happens to be unfinished, etc. There are plenty of problems throughout this text. And if you look at the title, of course, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, that is an unfinished sentence already. So it really points to the inconclusive, frustrating nature of the reading experience and of the texts that these readers encounter within the novel. If on a Winter's Night a Traveler mixes genres not only by incorporating a lot of different stories that have different genres or that belong to different genres, but even the story of the man and the woman, the two readers, which is the main thread, the thing that ties everything together in this book, it is already a kind of a fusion. Because it is on the one hand a love story and on the other hand it is a mystery. Of course, we want to find out as readers what happens to these two people in the end, if they end up together or not. But we are also curious about the texts, about the stories within the story. So there you have a love story and also kind of a literary mystery happening at the same time. There are clues throughout the book that tell us readers how it is that we should approach a text or a collection of texts like this one. For example, if you go to page 71, it says, all books continue in the beyond. And a little bit below that, books are the steps of the threshold. So you could say that if on a winter's night a traveler is reading, right? And it is also a philosophy of reading. If you go to the following page, it says, reading is going towards something that is about to be, and no one yet knows what it will be. Plenty of examples like that. And as a matter of fact, in the fifth novel that is included here, the narrator goes on with a theme that is very similar to what I have been sharing with you right now, and also gives you a kind of a meta-fictional kind of a approach to the text. Listen to this. I'm producing too many stories at once because what I want is for you to feel around the story a saturation of other stories that I could tell and maybe will tell, or who knows, may already have told on some other occasion. A space full of stories that perhaps is simply my lifetime, where you can move in all directions, as in space, always finding stories that cannot be told until other stories are told first. And it goes on like that. So Calvino's implication is, of course, that books never truly conclude, in a sense. When you finish reading a book, that is only the beginning of the adventure of reading, which goes from something that is perceptible, for example, a book as a physical object, the pages, the letters, the words, to something that is intangible, a story or ideas or thoughts or beliefs, experiences, all of the things that enrich our lives when we engage in reading. And reading, in addition, is not just the perusal of a text. It is so much more than that. For example, there is one point in the novel where the reader goes to Ludmila's house, and he learns a lot about Ludmila just by exploring her house. In other words, he is reading this house, which is a concept that Gaston Bachelard explored in a beautiful way in his book, The Poetics of Space. I have done a video on this book because it's one of my favorite books ever. So if you're interested, this is a really good companion piece to anything by Italo Calvino, but especially I would say to If on a Winter's Night, Traveler. And then also a person's body may be read too, right? And there's something to this effect if you go to page 156 of the novel that I would like to share with you. Listen to this. Lovers' reading of each other's bodies differs from the reading of written pages in that it is not linear. It starts at any point, skips, repeats itself, goes backward, insists, ramifies in simultaneous and divergent messages, converges again, has moments of irritation, turns the page, finds its place, gets lost. So it's beautiful style also, isn't it? Not just the ideas behind it, but the way in which they are conveyed. In addition to the two characters that I mentioned before as main characters, the man and the woman, there are at least two other characters that I believe we should mention. One of them is the Irish writer Silas Flannery. Okay, so look out for this one. And then there's another character named Hermes Marana, who believes that there's a literature that should be made up of apocrypha, of false attributions, of pastiches. So in other words, you have on the one hand in the character of Silas Flannery the image of the author, and in the character of Hermes Marana the image of the fraud. And by the way, Hermes Marana is a character that reminded me of the Argentine author Ricardo Piglia, not because he was a fraud, but because he liked to think, among other things, of the possibility of plagiarism as an art form. So there you have false attribution is something that definitely is connected to Ricardo Piglia, especially in his book Nombre Falso, where he plays with the figure of Roberto Arlt, which was a very important figure in Argentine letters. But don't let me go off on that tangent. So going back to the character of Silas Flannery, he is the author, and he has the opposite problem to the problem of the reader within this novel, and that is that Silas Flannery, this author, reads many books, but they all seem to him to be one and the same. This is something that may happen to us as readers, especially if we are engaging in the reading of the kind of writing that is formulaic. It happens with movie watching also. You get to a point where you watch so many superhero Hollywood movies that at some point you feel like you have watched the same movie over and over again, or romance movies, or horror movies for that matter. Everything that works very tightly within a genre. Now, at one point, the author that I have just mentioned considers writing a novel that consists of the beginnings of 10 different novels that do not conclude. In other words, within the novel by Italo Calvino, you have a character who is describing precisely Italo Calvino's novel. This technique is called Mise and abîme, as you may know, and it reminded me as I was reading this text of a text by André Gide, a novel titled The Counterfeiters. In this novel, you have a character who is thinking of writing a novel titled The Counterfeiters, which is the same text that you are reading at the time. So there are many examples of that in literature, but this is the one that is probably closest to me. And you can also find this type of technique, the Mise en abîme, in the 1001 Nights, in the Story of the Stone or Dream of the Red Chamber, also in the manuscript found in Saragossa. All of these are books that I have talked about in other videos, just in case you are interested. So as you may know, and as you may be able to tell by now, this novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, is not a neat novel. It's quite a messy novel, as a matter of fact. By its very premise, this novel is just all over the place, and it will put off many readers. I know many excellent readers who do not like this novel, and that is perfectly all right, of course. And I think one of the issues here at play is that in general, as readers, we like our stories to conclude. And what Calvino is doing in this text is precisely trying to force us to challenge that inclination that we have as more or less traditional readers. And I was thinking of a literary event that happened now exactly 20 years ago that suggests that we as readers, for the most part, generally speaking, are going to continue to quote-unquote read for the ending. In 2004, David Mitchell published Cloud Atlas, which is a novel that is virtually perfect, if you ask me, and that is made up of a series of interlinked novellas. David Mitchell credited Calvino with the idea of the structure of his novel. So he did give credit to Calvino, but he also made a major alteration, and this is it. His stories stop in the middle of the text, but we do get the conclusion in the second half of the book, in order. And the result is just marvelous, okay? Because Cloud Atlas conveys a sense of neatness and even, I would say, of perfection that is not present in If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, and that's appropriate too, because it is a random text because of its very nature, because of the very nature of its structure. It would be completely against the purpose if there was a neat structure to If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Now, I am not saying by any means that David Mitchell, quote-unquote, improved Calvino. The two texts, Cloud Atlas and If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, are very different and they have entirely different purposes. What I am pointing out to here is the prejudices that we have as readers. And I'm looking at myself here, right? I myself, when I talk about a given book, for example, this one that you are hearing about right now, I try not to quote-unquote spoil the book for those who watch my videos, as if one, the ending were everything that mattered, and two, as if a book review or a reflection or an analysis or all of the above were not in itself a kind of spoiler. If you think about it, that is really what it is. The back cover description of a book is already a kind of spoiler. That's why many times, whenever I get the chance, I like to buy a book and read it without even reading the back cover description. And you may ask me, Jorge, doesn't that lead to disappointment? Well, most of the time when I do that, I already know something about the author, and I may have a vague idea of what the book is about, so it's not a lot of a problem right there. But I would say that even in some cases, even if I just grab the book without knowing virtually anything about it, it might lead to disappointment, but I'm willing to take that chance because I would like to have sometimes, not all the time, as quote-unquote innocent and experience of the reading of this book as I can possibly have. So I think in those cases, most of the time when I have done that, I have just grabbed the book without reading the back cover description and read it. My experience has even been better. So that's something that, I encourage you to try at least at some point, especially if you're kind of sure, maybe with an author that you have already read and that you're going to enjoy. So as, to minimize the possibility of being completely and utterly disappointed. So the bottom line here, in the spirit of Italo Calvino, and If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, the fact is that there is no bottom line. Because this video, this reflection could just branch into so many other things. I have not even mentioned the Nouveau Roman, for example. That's another tangent of which we could go. So I would say that If on a Winter's Night a Traveler is just a fascinating meditation on what it means to read and to write. It is a book about the nature of books. I love books, and I'm sure that you do too. And I really, really loved this one. And I'm saying this as a person to whom books are basically his life. So I hope that you have a positive experience with this novel too. And you know what is the most amazing, mind-blowing thing about this novel? There's something that only this novel has achieved in the entire history of literature. And the funny thing, the incredible thing, is that nobody has realized this. So I'm going to share this secret with you, okay? So sit back and relax. Are you ready? Okay, here it goes. Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler is the only novel in the entire history of literature in which the Just kidding. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.